So it's my privilege and honor today to introduce Professor Julius Fridriksson. Julius Fridriksson is the director of the Center for the Study of Aphasia Recovery, C-STAR, and co-director of the McCausland Center for Brain Imaging. His passion is to improve the lives of persons with aphasia through improved research on aphasia recovery. Currently, Julius serves as the Vice President for Research at the University of South Carolina. So we're very lucky to have Professor Fridriksson presenting his seminar today on applying the clinical crystal ball to aphasia treatment outcomes. And I'd now like to pass over to Professor Fridriksson.
All right. Thank you, John. Let me just make sure that, can you see my screen now?
Yep, perfect.
Excellent. Thank you so much. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your group. I'm gonna be lecturing about some ongoing research that we have here at the University of South Carolina focused on aphasia treatment. I'm gonna focus mostly on a single trial that we are wrapping up now. We have some data that have already been published. And also I'm gonna be talking about some of our data that are in preparation for publication right now. So the name of this trial, we refer to it affectionately as the POLAR trial, or Predicting Outcome in Language Rehabilitation in Aphasia. So there are two things that I'm going to focus on today. The first one is I'm going to talk about our data that have to do with comparing semantic and phonologically focused treatment approaches in persons with aphasia, and then trying to understand what are the factors that relate to treatment outcomes. So both biographical and behavioral factors, can we use those at baseline to understand who is and who is not likely to respond to the kinds of treatments we administer in POLAR? Now, a little bit of background. I suspect that almost everybody that is watching is familiar with Broca's paper from 1865. I am particularly interested in that paper rather than the 1861 paper, because the latter paper talks about aphasia therapy. And this is really discussed in the literature, but Broca actually talked about applying therapy to a patient at his hospital, even though it was not systematic. He talked about different kinds of approaches that could perhaps be used, and including in that discussion, he sort of postulated about whether the right hemisphere would be able to take over language function that is lost as a result of left hemisphere damage. So that was a long time ago. Fast forward to very recently, and I wrote this paper with R.G. Hillis, who is at Johns Hopkins University here in the USA. It was just published in the Journal of Stroke earlier this year, and it was a review of sort of the most recent treatment literature on aphasia, focusing mostly on clinical trials, but sort of a narrative review on aphasia therapy. And I have to say, working on this paper with RG, I often thought about, how far along have we come since the days of Broca in understanding aphasia therapy and how useful it is to the folks that we want to help. So now, there is certainly considerable evidence to suggest that aphasia treatment is effective. One of my favorite papers is this study by Breitenstein et al., published in Lancet in 2017. This was a randomized controlled trial showing that sort of a mixture of what I would call impairment-based and functional approaches to aphasia treatment can improve speech production and, as importantly, communicative quality of life in persons with aphasia. So I think this paper is particularly important because it was published in a very high impact factor journal, and to me, certainly suggests that aphasia therapy is effective. And then, of course, another hugely important paper is this meta-analysis by Brady et al. From 2016. So in general, I tend to be very bullish on aphasia therapy. I think it works for some people and can be highly effective, but certainly many questions remain. And I just wrote down a few of those as I was preparing this PowerPoint. For example, we don't know very much about how much improvement can an individual expect when they start therapy. We don't know how treatment should be tailored to tackle impairment, needs, or goals of individual persons with aphasia. Other questions that came to my mind: is everyone a good candidate for aphasia treatment? That is certainly related to that first question. What kind of treatment is best? Or, if you will, probably more appropriate would be, what treatment is better? Because I suspect that in my lifetime, we're not going to figure out what treatment is best, but perhaps what is one type of an approach better than another one. And that, of course, is going to then relate to the previous question: is everyone a good candidate for aphasia treatment? And then what kind? Another question that I came up with is there an optimal dose for aphasia treatment? By itself, that question probably doesn't have a lot of meaning unless you relate it to what kind of an intervention you're talking about. So again, these questions are certainly much interrelated. Also, a question that I'm very much interested in: what are the neural mechanisms that support treated recovery from aphasia? Now, from a clinical standpoint, right now, that question probably isn't that important, but I believe that in the future, it is going to become more important, because I suspect that whenever we will make a major breakthrough in improving aphasia treatment outcome, that solution will include a biological answer. I don't think that it's going to be either behavioral or biological by themselves, but I think more likely it's going to be a combination of the two. So there's many more questions. I just threw out a few here, and I'm going to start towards getting some answers to some of these questions in my talk today using polar data. Now, I'm not going to have final answers on pretty much any of these things, but just as part of a large literature, and I want to emphasize, this is just a tiny piece of a large literature on aphasia treatment outcome that I hope that we are able to contribute some answers with the POLAR trial. So the POLAR trial is a project that is a part of our Center for the Study of Aphasia Recovery. This is a center grant that is funded by the National Institutes of Health here in the United States. It includes several different collaborators, and even though I'm talking about this single study today, I want to give credit to all of our team that is included in C-STAR. It's a large group of folks that and including most of them that deserve more credit than I do for completing this. So the study questions that I'm going to tackle today, there are three. The first one is, what treatment works best and for whom? And again, it might be more appropriate to say, what treatment works better? What factors are related to treatment success? So as somebody responds or doesn't respond to treatment, what are the factors that predict that response? And finally, is treatment outcome related to brain activation at baseline? And that gets back to the biological mechanisms that I talked about earlier. And also, as importantly, changes in brain activation. So the changes that we suspect are associated with changes in language function, can those changes in brain activation be related to the actual treatment outcome? So let me just hold on for a second. There we go. So this is a relatively large group study. The inclusion and exclusion criteria for POLAR are: the inclusion are the participants have to have incurred a left hemisphere ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke. They have to be at least 12 months post-stroke, be between the ages of 21 and 80, have been a primary speaker of English for at least 20 years, willing and able to provide written and verbal consent, and able to undergo magnetic resonance imaging scanning. We also have some exclusion criteria, including very severe aphasia as marked by a spontaneous speech rating score of 0 or 1 on the Western Aphasia Battery Revised, and also severely impaired auditory comprehension 0 to 1 on the WAB. We also exclude participants with bilateral strokes, just so that it would be at least presumably easier to make sense of the functional MRI results. Okay, here's the study design or study protocol. Starting from the left-hand side here, everybody undergoes baseline testing in week 1. That includes a very comprehensive test battery, which I will talk about later, as well as MRI scanning. Everybody is randomized then. This is a crossover trial. Half of the participants start therapy for 3 weeks with what we call phonologically focused therapy. And I'll talk in a little bit about what that is. After those 3 weeks of therapy, they undergo post-treatment testing. They have a couple of weeks of rest. Again, they have testing again following a second phase of treatment, which is again 3 weeks. So if you started with phonologically focused therapy, the second phase of treatment includes then semantically focused therapy. Then we have post-treatment testing again, immediately post-testing, follow-up at 1 month, and follow-up again at 6 months. Now, I just want to emphasize that the difference in the two groups and with regards to the randomization is that half of the participants start with what we call this phonologically focused therapy approach, and the other half starts with the semantically focused therapy approach. And then after the rest, they actually cross over to get the opposite treatment. Now, we have completed inclusion of 104 participants that underwent all aspects of the polar protocol. We ended up having 5 outliers with regards to treatment outcome. We therefore excluded those 5 outliers, and the data that I'm going to present today includes that from 99 participants. If we look at the treatment groups, those who got phonological therapy first versus those who got semantic therapy first, on a variety of factors, there were no statistically significant differences across the groups, and they were certainly not approaching statistical significance on any of these factors. So very similar groups, not surprising given that they were randomized at baseline. This is just for anybody who might be interested in neuroimaging data. These are the lesion overlay maps from the full sample in the top row. This is in radiological convention, so this is left-right flipped. And then proportional overlap for the phonological treatment group first, and then the semantic treatment first group here at the bottom. Now, aphasia therapy was dispensed for 6 weeks. There were 3 weeks of phonologically focused therapy. We selected 3 different approaches. Each one of those approaches is used for about 20 minutes per an hour-long session. And the first one is something that we refer to as the phonological component analysis by Leonard et al. The second one is a phonological production task by Kubeli et al. And Marshall et al. And finally, an in-house computerized phonological judgment task. Even though it's presented on a computer, this is something that a speech-language pathologist works with the participant on. We had initially decided that we were going to use the phonomotor treatment from Diane Kendall et al., but what we found was that actually paring that down to 20 minutes proved to be very difficult, so we abandoned that and therefore went to this in-house phonological judgment task approach that rounds out the 3 different approaches that we use for phonological treatment. The semantically focused therapy, the first one there is something that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, semantic feature analysis, and I put in 2 references there by Mary Boyle and then Boyle and Coelho. We also use the PACE task. Our PACE task is very much focused on semantic aspects of the stimuli. And then finally, the verb network strengthening treatment, or VNEST, by Lisa Edmonds et al. Now, I want to emphasize we are not under the delusion that we can somehow treat semantics without completely avoiding phonology, and vice versa with the phonological approach, that we can do that without completely staying away from semantics. But what we are simply trying here is to compare very broad approaches to treatment to see whether persons with aphasia respond differently to these groups of treatment approaches. And again, this is a crossover design, and we have blinded outcome raters for the treatment outcome. Therapy was dispensed 5 days a week, 1 hour at a time, for a total of 30 sessions. So 15 of the phonologically focused therapy and 15 of the semantically focused therapy. And all therapy is dispensed by the American Speech and Hearing Association certified speech language pathologists. If anybody is interested in our efforts on the fidelity front for polar, I would point them to this paper published in the AJSLP journal. And the lead author is Dr. Leanne Spell, who is our main clinician, who leads a large team of clinicians that are in charge of the polar study. The outcome measure is confrontation naming. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Philadelphia naming test. It now has been used far and wide in the aphasia treatment literature. To account for day-to-day variability in naming performance, the PMT was administered on 2 consecutive days at baseline, and performance was averaged across days. So that's the baseline testing with the PMT. For participants that by clinical judgment, if we thought there was a lot of variability across the 2 sessions at baseline, at every one of the follow-up points, we would also administer the PMT twice. So twice on 2 consecutive days of follow-up. When we didn't see a lot of variability from one session to the next, and there actually wasn't as much variability as I expected, we only administered 1 PMT for those individuals. What I'm going to talk about today as the dependent factor is what we call, and well, actually this is not from us, but we took this from the literature, proportion of potential maximal gain score. And you can see right there how we calculate it. The proportion potential maximal gain score, or PMG, is calculated by subtracting pre-treatment PMT score from post-treatment PMT score. So when I say PMT score, I'm referring to the number of correctly named items on the PMT. And then that is divided by the total number of items on the PMT, which is 175, minus the pre-treatment PMT score. This has actually been used quite a bit in the literature, not just in the aphasia literature, but also quite a bit in the physical therapy realm. The PMG was calculated separately for each treatment phase for a total of 2 improvement scores per participant, one for the phonological treatment phase and the other one for the semantic treatment phase. Now, I will say just right from the outset that we did all the analyses that I'm going to present here, also just looking at raw changes in correct naming. And by and large, the results that I present today are pretty much exactly the same, or they're very similar, regardless of whether you look at PMG or raw score. And I have to say, we had a lot of discussion in our group whether we should focus on the raw score or the phonolog or the PMG. This paper actually that I'm going to be mostly using to fuel this presentation was just accepted for publication in Brain Communications. If you see that, if you look at that paper, you will see that there is a large supplementary material section. There we include all the results from the comparisons of raw scores. So in that paper, you'll see that both results for PMG and raw scores, and what you'll find is that the outcomes or the results are very similar regardless of what the dependent factor was calculated. So a little bit about naming as an outcome measure. I've written a little bit about this on my blog, on the C-STAR blog. Naming by itself is a kind of a silly task. It certainly doesn't have much ecological validity. The reason why I like it, not that it's certainly perfect, there are many certainly caveats about using naming as a treatment outcome, but I like it mainly because it's a proxy. And what is it a proxy for? Well, in my mind, it's a proxy for overall aphasia severity. So the Western Aphasia Battery, which is one of the things that you can get on the Western Aphasia Battery, is the AQ score, or aphasia quotient, which is a measure of overall aphasia severity. There is a very strong correlation between overall PNT scores and WOB scores. So if you know how many items correct a given participant had on the PNT, you can predict with pretty high accuracy what their overall severity score is. So I would say, again, the naming score here is used as a proxy for overall aphasia severity. Now, I just want to put in a little plug for Grant Walker, who is a postdoc with Greg Hickok, who is one of the main collaborators on C-STAR. What Grant has been working on is looking at, can we predict WOB scores with high accuracy using the PNT? And not just that, but can we look at a small subset of items on the PNT to predict WOB AQ? And what Grant has found with 348 participants, that if you, with only 20 items, the items that you see listed there in that table on the right, if you simply knew what the responses were, both the types of errors and percent correct on those 20 items, you can predict scores on the WOB AQ, which is what you see on the y-axis here. So predicted scores compared to observed scores on the WOB, you can predict that with with a correlation of well over 0.9, with an R-squared of almost 0.84. So the idea is that if you know how well somebody scored on the PNT, you know with pretty high accuracy what their overall aphasia severity is. So that's a bit of a detour. I'll be happy to talk about these data at the end, but I would say Grant Walker is working on writing this up for publication right now. So I don't want to steal his thunder, but I think that it, at least in my mind, gives me some assurance that what we're measuring with the overall score on the PNT is not just naming, but it also gives us a good idea of what a given person's overall aphasia severity is. So outcome prediction, again, I'm going to talk about what is it that we can measure at baseline to say something about how likely somebody is to respond to therapy. I'm going to talk about biographical factors, things like age, sex, number of strokes, and several others, as well as baseline behavioral testing. This is a large test battery, and I'm just going to run through that really quickly here. That Apraxia Speech Rating Scale, that's by Edith Strand et al. The WOB-R, the Kissing and Dancing Test, the Pyramids and Palm Trees, the NIH Stroke Scale, the Northwestern Aphasia Test for Verbs and Sentences, the Philadelphia Repetition Test, the PALPA, including 7 subtests from the PALPA, all focused on phonology. The TALSA, that's Nadine Martin's test for auditory short-term memory, and the Ways Matrix test, which we took as a measure of sort of an overall cognitive function, if you can agree that there's such a thing. So I'm going to talk about the results. First of all, this is a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is from results that have been calculated by Alexandra Basilakos and Sigfús Kristinsson. Sigfús is the first author on the paper that I talked about earlier that is coming out in Brain Communications, and Alex Basilakos certainly was a huge part of the Polar trial, and many of the results that I'm going to be talking about today were actually calculated by Alex and presented by Alex initially. So I'm going to start by talking about comparing treatment approaches, semantic versus phonological therapy, and then talking about predicting outcome of therapy. So if we just go straight into which one of the treatment approaches worked better, controlling for treatment order, semantically focused therapy was superior to the overall outcome of the phonologically focused therapy. That was statistically significant at 0.041 p-value. There was no effect of treatment order, and you'll see that on the next couple of slides why that was pretty clear. Even though I'm not going to start by talking about predictors of outcome, I just want to point out that there was an interaction between aphasia severity and therapy type response. Individuals with more severe aphasia and less fluent speech responded better to the phonological therapy, even though the semantic therapy was overall better. And then milder cases, those individuals with milder aphasia responded better to the semantic therapy approach. And this is a theme that you will see coming up again and again. Now, this is just basically saying what I said before. In this table, you can see the first here, the phonological treatment first group. Those folks did not improve. The p-value there was 0.345 the first time around. The second time around, when they got the semantic treatment, there was a statistically significant improvement. Again, that was statistically significant. For those who started with the semantic treatment, again, statistically significant improvement. When they got the phonological improvement therapy, there was not a statistically significant improvement in the number of proportionally correct named items. Finally, the same results, I don't want to beat a dead horse too long, was basically showing the same thing, that for the group that received the phonological treatment first, here on the left-hand side, they responded better to the semantic treatment. So that what you see on the y-axis is this proportional improvement in treatment outcome. Their proportional improvement was over 8% improvement on the PNT. Again, for the group that got semantic treatment first, with the semantic treatment, they got better outcome. And in both cases, phonological treatment resulted in inferior results compared to the semantic treatment. Now, I want to emphasize that even though we see these group differences, there were huge differences within participants. So what we have done here, or Sigfus did in this graph, which is included in the paper, he simply ordered participants with regards to changes in proportional or PMG from baseline to after treatment. And what you will see, we ordered them from actually the greatest reduction in naming, starting on the left side, all the way over to the greatest improvement in naming following the phonological treatment. That's what you see in the blue bars. But then we showed side by side how those same respondents, those same participants responded to the semantic treatment. So it doesn't take much to see that there's certainly no correlation here. So if somebody responded well to the semantic treatment, well, it didn't really say much about how they responded to the phonological treatment. So huge variability with regards to treatment response, but also across the treatments. Now, I am going to show you a little bit of our really very long-term outcome data. This is something that we had started before COVID came on. We stopped doing this, obviously, when COVID started. These are data for the Western Aphasia Battery that we've been collecting on participants at least 1 year and often much longer post-completion of the polar study. So this is a project that was headed up by Alex Basilakos. And what you see here on the y-axis on the left is their baseline WAB-AQ. That's what you see on the gray bar. And then in the color bars, we have color-coded their change on the WAB-AQ from pre to post based on whether they showed greater or less improvement than 5 AQ points. So reduction in 5 points or greater of WAB-AQ is what you see in red. Greater improvement of than 5 WAB-AQ points is what you see in green. And those who didn't show either plus or negative change in WAB-AQ are those that you see in blue. So the y-axis on the right is what you see for the AQ change. Now, this really long-term outcome in 39 out of these 99 participants, or 104 participants, what you see here is that I think 12 of them showed long-term improvement that was greater than 5 AQ points. 5 actually had a reduction in WAB-AQ that was greater than 5 points, and then the rest of them neither improved nor got worse based on this 5-point WAB-AQ change. All right, so just a quick discussion about comparing treatment approaches. Overall, treatment focused on semantic processing yields superior results compared to treatment focused on phonological processes. However, different kinds of treatment work better for different individuals. Fluent aphasia, individuals with fluent aphasia responded better to the semantic treatment. Those with non-fluent aphasia responded better to the phonological treatment. And this brings me into the next batch of slides or results. There's a complex relation between personalized predictors and treatment success. Now, I would say that the basic message here is that personalized rehabilitation really matters. That if a person responds well to phonological treatment, it doesn't mean that they're going to respond well to semantic treatment, and vice versa. There can be a huge change depending on what treatment approach that person was getting. So predicting individual response to therapy, we use stepwise regression for this analysis. You can read more about the nitty-gritty of the actual analysis approach that went into this. But using this stepwise regression model for semantic treatment or semantic PMG, the amount of variance that we could explain was 0.35. The WAB spontaneous speech score emerged as the single best predictor. And there were several other factors that were included in the final model. The Ways matrix reasoning score, the self-reported number of days that people exercised prior to stroke onset contributed more to the reduction in the variance. The number of mixed errors produced on the Philadelphia repetition test, and then finally the number of semantically related errors produced on the Philadelphia naming test at baseline. So overall, again, when you combine all these factors into a single model, you can explain about 0.35 of the variance. Phonological treatment was different. Here, the stepwise regression model explained a lot less of the variance, or just over 20%. The most important factor here was overall stroke severity as measured on the NIH stroke scale. Here, a higher number means a more severe stroke. Now, what is interesting here is that a more severe stroke here actually predicted improved outcome with the phonological treatment. Other factors that included larger lesion volume. So larger lesion volume, what meant greater improvement. Self-reported use of antidepressants. Actually here, folks who did not use antidepressants actually reported greater outcome. That's in conflict with some of what we've seen in the motor literature. And so this overall model is not explaining that much of the variance, just over 1/5 of it, but different factors. But overall, the case was here that participants, if they did improve on the with the phonological treatment approach, they tended to have more severe aphasia than those who did not respond. So a little bit of discussion here about predicting therapy outcome. Treatment outcome is related to participant characteristics, better outcome overall with less severe aphasia, and that is if we collapse across phonological semantic treatment. For the semantic treatment approach, those with less severe aphasia had greater improvement. Those with more severe aphasia at baseline actually improved more with the phonological treatment. Finally, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of our neuroimaging data analysis. We wanted to understand, is there something about the lesion location at baseline that can tell you who is likely to respond to therapy? And for this analysis, we used a region of interest-based approach, where lesion load in language-related cortical regions, those regions were selected from the dual stream model. We published these language-specific regions in PNAS back in 2016. So the regions that were included as independent predictors of improvement are those regions that you see there in the red to yellow scale and the blue to green scale on the rendered image. We used univariate analyses. The dependent factor here was proportional change in naming, just like in the previous analyses that used behavioral data. And the analyses were relied solely on NESTAT, which is a part of the MRI-CRO suite that is designed and supported by Chris Rorden. So the lesion predictors, overall treatment outcome, when you collapse across the semantic and phonological treatment, those participants with greater damage to the posterior middle temporal gyrus, which is what you see here in orange, and those with greater damage to the middle occipital gyrus, those individuals tended to fare worse in treatment. So greater damage to those posterior regions, worse treatment outcome. Now, what was interesting was that the opposite was true for the phonological treatment. So in the blue to green color scale, these mostly anterior regions or dorsal stream regions, greater damage to those regions actually meant better response to the phonological treatment. And I'll talk in a little bit about why I think that that's the case. If we looked at the treatment outcome simply for the semantic treatment, it was not statistically significant. So overall outcome was associated with damage to the middle occipital gyrus and posterior middle temporal gyrus. However, when we included WAB-AQ, so overall severity, as a cofactor, only the middle occipital gyrus damage was a significant predictor of outcome. That's perhaps not surprising because we know that damage to the posterior middle and posterior superior temporal gyri are strong predictors of anomia severity. So there's probably a lot of redundancy there in the WAB-AQ and damage to those posterior regions. So therefore, the WAB-AQ, including that as a cofactor, may cancel out the usefulness of the posterior middle temporal gyrus lesion load in predicting outcome. And of course, not surprisingly, lesion size was correlated with damage to all ROIs in the WAB-AQ. Now, with regards to the phonological treatment outcome, it was associated with damage to dorsal stream regions. Now, I want to emphasize here that it's probable that what we are finding here is that simply the case that folks who have less fluent aphasia tend to have damage to those same anterior regions. And this has been shown certainly in one of our papers published in Brain back in 2013 and recently replicated by Gallardo Vidal et al. In 2021, also published in Brain. So greater damage here simply just means that those folks probably had less fluent speech, and therefore this is probably redundant with the fluency scale that we found was associated with better outcome with the phonological treatment approach in the earlier results that I reported. Okay, so no lesion location was associated with semantic treatment outcome, but remember that persons with milder aphasia tended to respond better to semantic treatment. Now, those with milder aphasia were much more likely to have an anomic aphasia, and that, as we know, has the least certain lesion profile. And it's possible that participants with similar overall milder aphasia severity are more likely to have different lesion locations, but respond similarly to the semantic treatment. And again, anomia, or the ability to name, is associated with a large network in the left hemisphere of the brain, which again goes to probably explaining why we found a non-significant result for the semantic treatment approach. The final analysis that I'm going to talk about, and I realize that I'm almost running out of time here, is looking at fMRI data. And these data are in preparation to be submitted for publication by Sigfús Kristjánsson. So I would be looking out for that paper, hopefully to come out sometime next year. Here, we were predicting overall changes in naming at 1 week post-treatment. Unlike most aphasia treatment studies that include fMRI, we did things very differently. We already built a model with our baseline factors to explain variance in the treatment outcome, and we simply wanted to look at, can the fMRI data explain any additional variance beyond this baseline model? And what we found when we collapsed across the semantic and phonological treatment, that the best baseline model that we could come up with that predicts overall treatment outcome included WAB-AQ, so overall severity, age, and diabetes status. So folks who had diabetes actually responded worse to treatment overall. And again, which I just talked about in the previous slides, damage to the middle occipital gyrus was also included in this baseline model. We simply started with this baseline model and then asked, does knowing brain activation, levels of brain activation, improve our prediction outcome? So the independent factors here are fMRI data or cortical activation associated with an overt naming test. We have published on this task many times before. First, I think in 2010 in the Journal of Neuroscience, but in a couple of other studies as well. We used lasso regression to compare 5 different models. We started with the baseline model, which is what I described above. The baseline model for all of our analyses includes WAB-AQ, age, diabetes, and damage to the middle occipital gyrus. And we simply asked, does knowing the level of activation in the left hemisphere language ROIs, which are the ROIs again that we derived from this dual stream model, does that improve outcome? We compared that to a model including the baseline data and the right homolog ROIs. So simply taking the ROIs that you see in the first model and flipping them over to the right hemisphere. We also compared baseline model and domain general regions. We looked at interaction between the lesion and brain activity. And then finally, we looked at the baseline model compared to paired lesional activity. Now, there are some previous studies that suggest that changes in brain activation in regions that are immediately surrounding the lesion might be important for supporting improvement in aphasia treatment. And again, a lot of these data and the results that I'm presenting are going to be included in this paper by Sigfús. Now, just really quickly, what do I mean by domain general or multiple demand regions? These regions were derived from Fedorenko et al. In 2013 paper published in PNAS. So this is fairly similar to what you see in most studies that report domain general regions. So the first results I'm going to talk about is using baseline fMRI activation. So fMRI activation before treatment starts, and then trying to predict change in correct naming from baseline to immediately after the second treatment phase. Here we simply collapsed across both phonologically and semantic treatment. So simply trying to predict who had higher or lower scores at the end compared to the beginning. Now, the baseline model here, including the WAB-AQ, age, diabetes, and lesion load, explained about 1/4 of the variance. but the strongest base model, and I'm going to explain what I actually am showing here in the graph on the right, the baseline model is always included or shown the proportional reduction in the variance is this cyan or blue color that you can see right here, starting with the left hemisphere language regions, right homologs. I'm sorry, let me see. No, I'm sorry. The next is the interaction, then the right homologs, the domain general regions, and then last the regional activation, perilesional activation. So if there is no change in the improvement in explaining the variance, you would expect the mean and the means to be very similar, or the R squared to be very similar. That is the case here for the domain general regions. There's almost no improvement in reduction of the variance if you add activation at baseline for these domain general regions. There's not much there for the interaction, not much there for the perilesional, perhaps some improvement, but by far the greatest improvement in explaining the variance was baseline activity in the left hemisphere language regions. Somewhat similar for the right hemisphere, but the magnitude was not as great. So simply knowing the level of activation in both the left and the right, in the left hemisphere, improved the explanation of the variance from 0.26 to 0.42. And the regions there in the left hemisphere that were important were the left inferior frontal gyrus, parsopercularis, angular gyrus, superior temporal gyrus pole, middle occipital gyrus, posterior superior temporal gyrus, and posterior middle temporal gyrus. I'm just going to show you the figures here. It wasn't the case that it was simply increase or decrease in activation. So this was an interaction. So the areas that you see there in red, greater activation in those regions was associated with greater improvement in naming. Less activation in the cyan or the blue regions was associated with greater improvement. So red, greater activation, blue, less activation, but always predicting greater or better outcome. So a lot of different regions contributed in the left hemisphere and also in the right hemisphere. So functional activation of aphasia treatment outcome, functional activation of baseline is associated with treatment outcome above and beyond lesion location. Improved outcome is not uniformly associated with increased or decreased activation in specific regions. Domain general regions don't seem to matter, and perilesional activity may matter, but not nearly as much as residual activity in the left hemisphere, as well as in the right homolog regions of language, right language homolog regions in the right hemisphere. So it's definitely not a left versus right thing. It's a mixed bag. And finally, I'm going to end with showing you changes in cortical activation. No, not simply the baseline activation, but rather does change in activation from baseline to immediately after the second treatment phase, is that change in activation associated with change in correct naming? And what we found here is that the baseline model, there was a little bit of a difference in the number of participants in the previous analysis that I showed and the change analysis that I'm showing right now. There was actually a greater reduction in the variance with the baseline model with an R squared of 0.34, but it was really only one model out of the 5 that resulted in a substantial reduction in variance, and that was the right hemisphere language ROIs. So knowing how much change in activation occurred in the right hemisphere associated with treatment, we got a significant reduction in the variance that went from 0.34 to 0.43. The regions that really mattered here was actually reduction in the anterior insula and reduction in the posterior superior temporal gyrus, and increase in activation in the posterior insula. Increase in posterior, decrease in anterior. So there's still a lot of variability in the outcomes of aphasia treatment studies, and that try to use fMRI or neuroimaging to explain treatment outcome. There seems to be some signal that suggests that the right hemisphere might be contributing to better outcome. But if you read this paper by Stephen Wilson and Sarah Schneck that came out very recently in the Neurobiology of Language, what you will find out is that there's a huge amount of variability across studies, and there's a lot of work left to do. So I'm going to end on that note. I suspect that I'm completely out of time, but yeah, just wanted to acknowledge the people in the Center for the Study of Aphasia Recovery, and I would be happy to field any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Julius. That's for that fascinating walkthrough of a pretty big body of work. It looks like that all that research has a lot to say about aphasia, recovery and prediction. And it also looks like there's no simple answers there. We do have a few questions if you have time.
Of course.
First of all, there's a comment from someone with aphasia in the chat who's been listening. They said, it's very interesting. You have to remember that people keep improving all the time, years and years later. 15 years after my stroke, I've begun reading again up to about grade 4. Also, my speech has deteriorated a little because of COVID.
Do you want me to make a comment on that?
If you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we see people as far as 20 years out who come into our treatment studies and make substantial gains and are still telling us not just about improvement in language. I mean, we see folks with hemiparesis that, out of nowhere start getting movement in their leg and arm. So I'm not surprised, and I certainly believe in long-term recovery, and I don't believe that aphasia recovery is ever really over.
I think it's something science is quite happy to have been wrong about. So one question we have is from Sam Harvey. It says, about a third of the subjects with long-term follow-up, their WAB-AQ worsened by more than 5 points. Do you think there's an explanation for this?
Yes, I do think so. So if you look at, there's a paper that Alex Basilakos was the first author on, I can't remember off the top of my head, that looked at this. What we found was that some of this variance in the reduction mainly could be explained by increase in white matter hyperintensities. So what I suspect is going on here is just simply brain deterioration. And if you look at the literature on long-term outcome, it seems, at least across the 3 studies that I can think of at the top of my head, about a quarter of the participants that are looked at in the long term are actually getting worse. About half of them are getting better, and about a quarter seem to stay the same.
So that might correlate with age as well.
Yep, absolutely.
We've got a 3-fold question from Miranda Rose. Thank you, Julius, for this high quality and elegantly designed study. First one is, can you comment on the challenges in using proportional change as an outcome? Do you want to start with that one? Or?
Do you want me to start one by one?
Yeah, the other one's a bit longer.
Absolutely. So the challenge certainly is that somebody who doesn't have a lot of improvement, a lot of room for improvement, but improves numerically not that much, proportionally could be shown to have a major, very large response to outcome. Now, the vice versa could be said for folks who have a lot of room for improvement, could improve, let's say, by, I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there, like 10 items. That might perhaps have a functional significance. But what it suggests, if you look at proportional change, is that they didn't respond at all. I will say that it is reported in Sifus's paper that the correlation between proportional outcome and raw change is actually quite high.
And it's good that you analysed with both raw and proportional.
Yes,
Second part of that question is, what are your thoughts on the efficacy of these treatments, given the small number of people, 12, I think, that maintained outcome at follow-up?
oh my God, efficacy question. I mean, I don't really have a good way to measure efficacy. So if we can agree that 5 points on the WAP-AQ is, you know, clinically significant improvement, I would say that perhaps a third of our participants saw some kind of a long-term outcome improvement. But overall, I would think that our data are showing that it's a very mixed bag with regards to improvement. Perhaps there are treatments that work for, no, there are individuals that might respond well to whatever treatment you throw at them. And there are individuals, regardless of what treatment you use, they're not going to respond. But in the general, it's a very mixed bag.
Mm. Okay.
Now, going back to what I talked about at the beginning, even though I tend to think that aphasia therapy is effective and worthwhile for people with aphasia, I tend to think that overall aphasia treatment as it is dispensed today in clinical practice, that the outcome is probably somewhat underwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Third part of Miranda's question is that there was huge inter-subject variability in participants in terms of outcomes.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about this for future trial design? Because we found this in COMPARE as well.
Thank you. I think that, so what I would glean from that, and I contacted Katarina Breitenstein back when their study first came out, and they kind of reported the same thing, that there was a huge variability in their study as well. What I would think is that if I was going to design a next phase trial based on these results, I would stratify, if I was wanting to prove that a given approach is effective, I would use the baseline predictors to actually include and exclude participants. Simply to say that we need to find out what type of therapy works best for what kind of an individual. But again, that goes back to that paper that I wrote with RG. I strongly believe, and because of lack of better evidence, that aphasia therapy needs to be personalized, and not just the language therapy, but also just the overall approach that you use, whether you're using functional approaches like participation. There is room for everybody to receive services that could help them, but that probably varies a lot from one person to the next.
Julius, do you have another 5 minutes to answer questions, or do you need to leave?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yep. Sam Harvey again says, people with aphasia and clinicians know that naming ability in aphasia can vary quite a bit from day to day. Were you able to estimate naming performance variability on the PNT and account for this in the regression models?
So we simply averaged across the baseline. I would say I've been using the PNT for a long time, and I was surprised how little variance we actually saw. But I'm really just saying that from eyeballing it. I don't really have much to say about it. I think that it's pretty likely that we will publish on it, what kind of variability to expect, but we did not account for it in the models. That's a great question. And we probably could try to model that variance, but we didn't, other than just to average performance.
Mm-hmm. Chelsea Larkman asking, should the decision to select phonological versus semantic therapy approach be based more on aphasia severity and fluency rather than error types and breakdown?
That's a great question. So based on the data that I showed today, I'm only talking about correct naming. If you simply only want to rely on those kinds of data, it's clear, yes, that can be used to predict who responds. In this case, if you have milder aphasia, you clearly should be focusing on the semantic treatment. If you have more severe aphasia and less fluent speech output, you should be focusing on phonology. But there is a paper forthcoming from Grant Walker that looks at these data in a much more nuanced way, suggesting that simply not looking at changing correct naming, we have another measure that shows us whether participants are getting closer to the target as a result of the treatment. And so you can use the modeling based on error types to simply look at, is the person now closer to being correct than they were at baseline, rather than just having this binary decision of correct or incorrect.
So it's a bit more sensitive. Thank you. And final question, was there any, somewhat similar, was there any correlation between the types of errors made and the response to treatment types, e.g. phonemic versus semantic paraphasias? No,
and you know what, that was somewhat surprising. At least in these analyses, there didn't seem to be any difference. If I remember, semantic errors at baseline on the PNT did contribute some to the reduction in the variance with the semantic treatment outcome, but it certainly wasn't anything that was to write home about, really.
Always more complicated than we imagine, than we theorize.
Yes.
All right. Don't want that slide. It's going to wrap up. Oops. Bear with me. So I just want to highlight our next seminar before we close. We're very lucky to be able to welcome the CRE's own Professor Miranda Rose, and she'll be talking about constraint-induced aphasia therapy or multimodality aphasia therapy, which is better and for whom. So it'll be the results of the COMPARE randomized control trial that investigated constraint-induced aphasia therapy plus versus multimodal aphasia therapy, and compared those to usual care in people with chronic post-stroke aphasia. So that is next on the 29th of September, 4 to 5 p.m. Melbourne time, 7 a.m. British Standard Time, and 11 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. So once again, I'd like to thank Julius for your presentation. Absolutely fascinating. The recording will be available on our website in a couple of weeks, and we look forward to seeing everyone next month. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John.